1980s to the 1990s, Interstate 70, Ohio, and Indiana. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, an alarming sight was unfolding around Interstate 70, stretching from Indiana and Ohio. The bodies of numerous young men and boys were being found dumped along the interstate, mostly in ditches, streams, and wooded areas, with all of them being strangled to death. The killings seemed to have stopped in the early 90s, but little do we know, they were just the beginning. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we look into the true makings of a monster. A man who from very early on in his childhood had issues, and as they translated into adulthood, those issues and fantasies became more grim and twisted. Who was this killer? What do we know about his victims? And who was a supposed serial killer that hunted this area of the Midwestern United States? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, the I-70 Strangler. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and I want to welcome you again to this week. And I decided to pivot back into the realm of true crime and serial killers, and specifically, I feel like that has been the videos where I've been getting the most traction on lately, the most interactions, and I'm trying to obviously grow my listener base as much as possible. So I decided to go back into this realm, and this case was particularly interesting. And that's kind of what made me dive into it. Now, before I get started on this week's episode, I do want to put this disclaimer out there that this topic contains a lot of sensitive themes, such as sexual assault, some, kind of disturbing behavior as well. Now, if that is something that makes you a little queasy or uncomfortable, I highly encourage you to check out all of my other episodes. But for this week, again, back to true crime. And even though this case in particular, the I-70 Strangler, is still kind of classified, is unsolved in a lot of places. If you Google the case, it'll say it's still unsolved. The suspect in this case was thoroughly connected to the killings, and pretty much the evidence proved that he was the one responsible. However, he never saw a criminal trial, and you might be wondering why that is, and if I told you, it would spoil the whole story, so you're going to have to wait and find out. So, with that being said, there won't be a traditional theories section like in my other episodes, and instead I will do a lot more context, information, and stuff like that as to why this case wasn't solved as quickly, and kind of everything in the area of kind of just like leaving no stone unturned for you guys, since there is not that kind of theory and discussion section of the episode. And at the very end, I'll also kind of touch on another serial killer that was active in this same exact area as the I-70 Strangler in a series of years as well, which is kind of wild and kind of crazy that there was two serial killers operating in one particular area simultaneously at one point. It's kind of a very interesting thing that I found and discovered while doing my research, so I will briefly touch upon that. But as well, of course, throughout this episode, I'll provide some important context to all of this, and then at the very end, I'll kind of wrap it all up. So to break that all down, I am first going to go over the initial swath of killings from 1980 to 1991, break down the life and backstory of our main suspect, and then get into the killings he committed after 1991, as the two instances of killings are kind of separate from each other, as the killer moved from dumping his victims' bodies on the side of the road to rather burying them at his house. Now, after we cover all of that, we will break down, like I said, this other similar case, and then we'll kind of just wrap it all up at the very end. Just in case, again, my format for this episode wasn't fully transparent to you guys as the listeners. Now, Interstate 70 is a massive highway that stretches from east to west along the United States, and it crosses through numerous states. It is 2,171 miles long and stretches just outside from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way to Cove Fort, Utah. It goes through cities such as Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Indiana, St. Louis, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, and Hagerstown, Maryland. This expansive highway was home to two serial killers operating almost simultaneously. Again, I touched on that a little bit. Again, I find that very fascinating. As somebody who's done a little bit of research on true crime, I'm surprised that I've not ever heard of that. Now, this episode we're mostly going to be talking about the Strangler, of course. Now, initially, the first collection of bodies found alongside the highway between 1980 and 1991 were classified as isolated killings. And it wasn't until the 1990s when the cases were slowly connected together by a retired police sheriff of Indiana by the name of Virgil Vandergriff. Now, Virgil would receive a couple phone calls by some of these victims' families as their cases remained unsolved and kind of not really going anywhere. Now, when these families originally contacted Virgil, they said, hey, police are dragging their feet, our family members are missing, we really have no leads, what can you do now that you have become a private investigator? You've now retired, you become a private investigator, is there anything you can do to help us? Now, Virgil started to connect the dots between the relation and similarities of these men who were being found dumped along the I-70 corridor, mostly between Columbus, Ohio and Indianapolis, Indiana, and he found some similarities between these two initial victims and these other cases as well. Now, it turns out that a magazine editor also reached out to Virgil and told him about a swath of missing men from the Indianapolis area that could be related to this case, and it turns out they were. Now, it is important to note the similarities that Virgil did find before we dive into this first batch of victims. Now, many of the men had similar builds and body types. They were all young men or even adolescent age, and all of them seemed to frequent gay bars around the Indianapolis area and seemed like they were being picked up from these locations. Which, of course, pointed a pattern to Virgil that this was a serial killer who was picking out his victims at these bars, and most of these victims, where a cause of death could be determined, showed strangulation as the cause of death, and hence the I-70 Strangler case fully took shape. Now, let's get into the first swath of victims from 1980 to 1991. On June 16th, 1980, the body of 15-year-old Michael Petrie would be found in a rural area of Hamilton County, Indiana. His body would be found fully nude. Now, even though Michael was so young, he was widely regarded around these gay bar scenes as being a prostitute, which is very unfortunate considering he was so young and that his life was in a state where he needed to do that for himself. Now, Michael's body would be discovered 9 days after he originally disappeared. However, 3 days after he was reported missing, he would reportedly be last seen riding around the local area in a stranger's car. Now, how much information that gives us in regards to the Strangler is, of course, very little. Now, the cause of death of Michael was determined to be strangulation. 2 years later, the second victim of the Strangler would be found and identified as 22-year-old Maurice Taylor. Now, Maurice Taylor would be discovered also in rural Hamilton County, Indiana, near the town of Atlanta, Indiana. Maurice was known to frequent the gay bar scene as well, around Indianapolis, and he was homeless and actually living in a boiler room of an apartment building during the time he was missing. His body would be found on July 21st, 1982, and would remain unidentified for an additional 8 months, slowing down pretty much what progress was being made by authorities at this point. Now, it is believed that because Maurice was homeless, much like Michael, he was also selling his body for money in and around these gay bar scenes in Indianapolis. The next victim would be found on October 3rd, 1982, and would be identified as 14-year-old Delvoid Lee Baker, who would also be found in rural Hamilton County. He would be found semi-nude near a river. He would last be seen the night prior on October 2nd in such witnesses they say that he saw him in downtown Indianapolis in a blue van driven by a white man with a mustache. Now, Delvoid told his parents that he was taking his bike and riding into the city at around 10:30 p.m. that night, and that he was going to be late because he wanted to go to the cinema. Now, Delvoid was also a frequenter of these gay bars for the past 3 months, and according to one of his friends that went out with him that night, they prostituted themselves for pretty much the past 3 months, and that he went out very frequently with this friend of his, and that's kind of what they did to make a few extra bucks and kind of so on and so forth. Now, initially, police thought his death was unrelated, as he was the only black victim, but that's clearly not the case, as pretty much every other metric for how the Strangler operated does fit into Delvoid's case. The next victim would come on May 28, 1983, and would be identified as 22-year-old Michael Riley. Michael would last be seen visiting the Vogue Theater, which was a gay movie house in Indianapolis. He would be last seen leaving the venue with an unknown man. Riley's body would be discovered in Hancock County, south of Greenfield, Indiana, with the cause of death determined to be strangulation. The next victim would be 17-year-old Eric Rotker. He would vanish on May 7th, 1985, and his body would be discovered only a few days later in rural Preble County, Ohio, outside of the town of Lewisburg. Now, he would be found shirtless, with the cause of death determined to be strangulation, and it had looked like the killer had used a rope to do it. Now, he was scheduled to attend some interviews for a summer job the following day on the 8th. However, he would never make it to any of those interviews. Witnesses did say they last saw Eric waiting at a bus stop, and someone stopped and offered him a ride, and this would be the last anyone would see of him. Now, this becomes our first outlier in the victims' profiles, as Eric was not noted to have been involved with the gay bar or club scenes at all, and friends of Eric were adamant that he was not gay. Of course, that could be a lie, but we truly don't know that. Now, again, it is rumored as well that Eric had friends who were involved in the drug trafficking industry. Again, all just rumors. However, this does seem to be an outlier in our victim profile, but perhaps merely this was a coincidence and was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next victim would be Michael Allen Glenn, who was 29. Now, his body would be also found semi-nude in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio, on August 15th, 1986. Michael lived on the outskirts of Indianapolis and worked as a handyman. It is unsure whether or not Michael had the relations like the other victims did in regards to being involved with the local gay bars. Now, Michael Glenn was also strangled to death, most likely with a rope, and kind of law enforcement concluded that. The next victim would be James Robbins Jr., who disappeared on October 15th, 1987, and he was 21 years old. He would leave his mother's house to walk around the southern portion of Indianapolis, and this would be the last time he would be seen by anyone. His body would be found in a ditch alongside I-70 in Shelby County, Indiana. On August 12th of 1989, another victim would be found, and this time it would be 26-year-old Stephen Elliott. His body was also dumped in Preble County, Ohio, and was also strangled by using a rope. Stephen had come out as gay to his father in 1979, and when he decided to leave his family home, he quickly got wrapped up in things such as prostitution and even developed a drinking problem. Again, this kind of fits the bill of a majority of the other victims in relation to their connections to the gay bar scene and just being kind of gay in general, and it seems that there's a pattern that's going on with the killer, again, picking up these victims from these gay bars in and around Indianapolis. The next victim would be Clay Russell Boatman, who disappeared on August 14th of 1990. Now, he was last seen in Richmond, Indiana, leaving his apartment to go visit a gay bar called Our Place. Now, his body would also be found in a ditch in Eaton, Ohio. Now, just a short time later, on September 9th, 1990, Thomas Clevenger Jr., who was 18, vanished, and his body would later be discovered at an abandoned railroad in Greenville, Ohio. Clevenger, who grew up poor, started to engage in male prostitution to earn extra money, which, as many of the other victims did, of course. Now, this, unfortunately, made him an exact target for the Strangler. Now, almost a year later, in August of 1991, 42-year-old Otto Becker would be found dead in a ditch on a gravel road in Henry County, Indiana. Witnesses last saw him riding with an unknown man alongside I-70, but no leads came out of that tip. Now, this would conclude the first swath of killings that were associated with the Strangler, and again, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, they weren't all deemed to be connected at first, and this was for a variety of reasons. Now, the police saw all of these killings, and of course, we'll get into the other serial killer that targeted a very similar demographic, and this kind of led to what I like to think of confusion, because again, I'll go over him in a little bit later, but these killings were very spaced out, so initially law enforcement was like, these could be just kind of unrelated, and unfortunately during this time period, gay men weren't on the top of the priority list, and that sounds absolutely terrible, because it's a complete just lack of effort on behalf of the police departments, but that was their mindset. So these were all isolated, they were all unsolved, and nobody really was putting the connections together that this could have been another serial killer kind of stalking the I-70 corridor, and most notably in Indianapolis. Now, when Virgil Vandergriff got the calls from concerned families, these disappearances, the two that the concerned families called about, fell in line with these. Now, in 1994, Alan Broussard and Roger Goodlett would disappear just weeks apart after going down to gay bars within Indianapolis. Virgil, when he started investigating these cases, slowly realized that the police viewed these kidnappings and deaths of gay men as, of course, like I mentioned, very low on the totem pole in terms of priority, and many within the Indianapolis police departments looked at it as isolated kind of vanishings and not a serial killer. Now, of course, that's when Virgil completely thought the opposite, and he started doing the legwork and eventually led him to a man who had actually survived an encounter with the man believed to be the I-70 Strangler. Now, it turns out when Virgil was doing the digging, he was, of course, contacted by a friend of Roger Goodlet, who said he too was almost a victim of the Strangler. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. Now, this man, who went by Tony for anonymity reasons, approached Virgil, and when he started speaking to Virgil, Tony said that he originally went to the police about the disappearance of his missing friend. In the events that unfolded to him personally, the police more or less blew him off for participating in some type of weird sexual fantasy, when in reality that's not even close to what it was. Now, Tony goes on to explain the ordeal to Virgil like this. Tony had met a man at a gay club one night, and he was drawn to this man because this man just happened to be looking at a missing persons flyer of Roger Goodlet, who was of course, Tony's friend that went missing. Tony thought that maybe this man had known Roger in some way and was drawn to him. When Tony went up and introduced himself, the mysterious man told Tony his name was Brian Smart. Brian told Tony that he was a landscaper and did a lot of work at a big house in the area. Tony then went on to ask if Brian knew Roger at all, to which Brian denied. The two then started to discuss and talk and became further acquainted with one another. And Brian explained to Tony that at this large house he was doing work for, had a pool and the owners were out of town and were letting him use the house and invited Tony over. Tony agreed, and he and Brian left for this house. Now, if this is the part of the story that sounds fishy, and that maybe this story is going to take a turn and that it's going to go bad, your intuition is right, and we will get into that very soon. Now, Tony stated that they got into Brian's car, a Buick car with Ohio plates, and drove to this house. Tony did not remember where this house was located because he was virtually unfamiliar with this area. He had never been there before. However, when recapping the events of the incident to Virgil, Tony remembered the details of the house very well and described it as a large Tudor-style home, almost kind of like a ranch house. Tony later said that the house also had a large and long driveway with the name Farm somewhere in the title of the house. The rest of the name he couldn't fully remember. Once arriving at the house, Brian took Tony through a side door of the house, and it was filled with a lot of assorted junk. When arriving at the pool room, Tony noticed a plethora of mannequins that were up and kind of set up around the pool, almost like they were set up this way to make it look like some sort of party was going on. That's, of course, what Tony thought at first. He still thought it was pretty weird. But yeah, this to me, the mannequin thing, the junk, of course, I don't think was a clue at all, and we will get into that a little bit later. But I think it just goes to show you how weird this quote-unquote Brian Smart was, and of course, we'll get into him here in a little bit. Brian offered a drink to Tony, and Tony declined, thinking that Brian maybe have spiked his drink, and he was just not liking the way the situation kind of felt at this point. Now, Tony recalls that he felt like Brian then took some type of drug, possibly cocaine, as Brian's mood suddenly changed, and he became much more vocal and animated in his movements and behavior, almost like whatever he took made him more open and gave him the head rush needed to do what he was going to do following this. Brian then offered to Tony that they participate in autoerotic asphyxiation. Now, if you don't know what that is, I am sorry that you were hearing it from me for the very first time. Now, the second I saw this, I don't know if anybody is... I feel like a lot of people are familiar with the show South Park. They did a whole episode on that like over a decade ago, and it's hilarious, and I know I'm sidetracking here, but whenever I did my research into this and I saw this come up, all I could think about was that South Park episode, so that kind of makes me laugh quite a bit. But if you don't know what that is, now, autoerotic asphyxiation is the sexual practice of cutting off of someone's airflow, for example, choking, or other means, while that person pleasures themselves, for lack of a better word. Again, really fucked, and I'm not here to dog on anyone's sexual practices, but that's just enough to make me feel a little uncomfortable just talking about it. Now, Tony hesitantly agreed to this, and when he and Brian then took turns. Now, Tony wrapped a hose around Brian's neck, and did the deed, and when Brian was finished, it was Tony's turn. However, Tony got the feeling that something wasn't right, and he told Virgil when he was telling him the story that he felt like Brian was plotting to kill him. Brian wrapped a hose around Tony's neck, because I used a hose. Again, weird. I'm just telling the story. When Brian wrapped the hose around Tony's neck and choked him, however, Brian didn't stop and he kept choking him harder. Now, Tony viewed the only way out of this situation was to pretend and act like he passed out to hopefully get Brian to stop. Now, Tony did pretend to pass out, and that did make Brian stop. And when Tony, kind of like quote unquote awoke from this pretending to pass out state, Tony got frantic and said that it wasn't his intention for Tony to pass out, and that it would be best if Brian brought him back to the city. Now, Brian drove him back to the city and dropped Tony back off, and they agreed to meet once more, and Tony told Virgil that the meeting date to meet Brian for the second time was coming up very soon. Virgil took that away from the fact that if Tony took this drink at the beginning, that it was most likely drugged and he would be dead and therefore unable to tell this story. So if it wasn't for, quote-unquote Tony, the I-70 Strangler might have never been caught. Now, Virgil took this information and decided that the best course of action would be for Tony to meet with Brian for a second time at, this agreed-upon date to try and catch him in the act, or at least identify him. However, Brian never showed, and that lead ended up being a dead end. Now, at this point in the independent investigation, the case would go cold. With no more leads on quote-unquote Brian, it left Virgil back at square one as he kept following up with law enforcement. However, approximately a year later, Tony would see Brian Smart again. Tony would bump into Brian Smart at a gay bar, and Tony knew that this was the only chance to find out who he actually was. When Brian noticed Tony at the bar, Brian fled immediately. Tony chased after him, and he was able to get the license plate number for Brian's car as he fled, and it turns out that, quote-unquote, Brian Smart was not who he said he was, but rather, he was somebody by the name of Herb Baumeister. Now, who was Herb Baumeister? To truly understand the makings of this man, that would more than likely be the I-70 Strangler, and to me, he is, and I guess that's probably spoiling the story, but who cares at this point? I just talked to you about autoerotic asphyxiation, which I never thought I'd do on this podcast, but we're past the point, so there it is. I spoiled it. I'm sorry. Now, to truly understand Herb Baumeister, we need to go back into his upbringing, as it could explain his killer and twisted tendencies and how they've taken shape. Now, Herb Baumeister was born on April 7th, 1947, to Dr. Herbert Baumeister Sr. and Elizabeth Baumeister in Indianapolis, Indiana. Now, what we know about Herb's childhood is relatively unknown, but what we do know is that some of his odd behavior began to take shape in his adolescence and eventually into his teenage years. Now, when Herb went to school, he would often discuss with fellow classmates about his fascination with dead animals. He also displayed numerous forms of antisocial behavior and was just kind of a very strange kid. An interview that was done with an ex-classmate of Herb's also describes Herb's fascination with human urine, which is just disgusting. But again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm telling a story, so I'm going to keep going. Now, there was also an incident with himself and a rumor that Herb urinated on a teacher's desk at the school as some sort of practical joke. Now, even though that Herb had these very odd spurts of behavior, it wasn't until he entered his full-on teenage years for the friends that he did have to slowly distance themselves from him. They knew his behavior wasn't normal, and they didn't want to be around somebody like that. It was even to the extent that his mother and father were getting impacted. Now, because of this behavior, his father, Herbert Sr., started spending a lot of time not in the house and was just trying to get away from his son because he was so ashamed of him. And his mom, even though she didn't leave the house, was also deeply disturbed by these characteristics and kind of behavior that he was showing. Now, the school did end up reaching out to his parents to let them know that his behavior was kind of bubbling over into the classroom as well, and Herbert Sr. decided the best course of action would be to get Herb some type of mental help. Now, when Herb was brought to the hospital, it is widely observed that Herb was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and also possibly having some sort of multiple personality disorder. However, after this initial visit, no follow-up appointments would be made, and if you know anything about schizophrenia or any mental health condition, you need multiple checkups and treatment to make sure that you were okay, and that unfortunately just didn't happen. And during this time period, mental health was not as widely understood as it is now, so kind of a combination, a perfect storm of things going on right here out of the get-go in terms of why Herb was the way that he was. Now, Herb spent the senior year of high school pretty much as a social outcast, and when he graduated in 1965, he decided to enroll at the nearby Indiana University. However, after just a semester, Herb dropped out, much to the disdain of his father. Herb was adamant about not going back to college, so Herbert Sr. thought the best course of action would be to help him get a job, in which he did, working for the Indianapolis Star newspaper, where Herb would work in the copy department. Now, Herb would eventually move into advertising, and his boss was able to handle his dark sense of humor, but a majority of the office found him very weird and his jokes often very distasteful. Eventually, Herb, looking for acceptance, felt like he wasn't going to get it from the newspaper and quit. Again, this greatly upsetted his father. His father, pretty much at this point, thinking that Herb is just a disappointment to the family, somehow was able to convince Herb to enroll back in Indiana University in 1967, where he would just take one class, and that would end up being a human anatomy class. Now, during this time period, Herb had the feeling, and kind of knew that he was gay, and was using a lot of his free time he had, now that he was only taking one class, he would head down to the gay clubs in Indianapolis to socialize and take in the scenes. Of course, he never went public with any of this, as he felt like most likely this would have even made his dad even more mad and more disappointed with him at this point, and of course he didn't want that. Herb's dad thought it would be best if he was actually instead using this free time he had. Of course, Herb's dad had no idea that he was going down to the gay clubs and everything like that with his free time, but Herbert Sr. was like, hey, I think that you should try and do something else with your free time, and he had Herb join a political club to try and connect with more people. Now, while at this politics club at Indiana University, he would meet his soon-to-be wife, Julie. Now, if you're curious about the fact that I just said wife, that's because after he had met Julie, he decided to actually try and put his fantasies behind him, kind of with, he had the fascination with dead animals, he had the fascination with death a little bit, fascination with urine of all things. Again, weird, gross, disgusting. He tried to put it all behind him, and even he knew that he was gay, and he even repressed that too. And he wanted to just try and be, quote unquote, normal, like his family wanted. So he started focusing more on Julie and started pretending that, that he was straight, more or less. And he put this past behind him and buried it as best he possibly could. However, Herb still had this desire in him to be gay. And in the back of his mind, and because of this, his mental health took a toll on him as he was hiding who he truly was. Now, his marriage suffered as well, as he wasn't comfortable to have sexual relations with his wife, and Julie often said it was a struggle to get him to do so. Now, this sent his mental health spiraling, and ultimately he was admitted to a psych ward for a couple months. Now, after a couple months and after he left the psych ward, his life seemed to turn around a little bit. He was still repressing his actual feelings and urges, but he kind of learned ways around them. Now, Herb would bounce from job to job and eventually ended up working for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and had a mildly successful career there. Although he was labeled by his coworkers as kind of like an oddball and weird, and also as a quote-unquote closet homosexual, he was able to climb the ranks all the way to program director within the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, but unfortunately, he got fired. Now, it turns out he wasn't a fan of his boss, and in an act of spite, he urinated on his desk, which I don't know why this is just the impulse as a way to prank someone or get back at them, but what do I know? Now, from what I could find, he actually did this a couple times, and his boss suspected it was him, but because of his, his quality of work and kind of the way he kind of set the tone in the office, he kind of just swept it under the rug, which is crazy to me. I'm doing research on this, and I read that, and I'm like, really? And unfortunately, that was until one day Herb pissed on his boss's desk, and He just happened to urinate on a letter that was addressed to then Indiana Governor Robert D. Orr, which that sent him out the door. Like, it was kind of like, oh, you can piss on my desk so many times, but the second you piss on my desk and there's a letter to the governor on it, that's where I draw the line. Now, at this point, Herb would bounce around at jobs once more. He started picking up a drinking habit as a coping mechanism and started frequenting the gay bar scenes again, all while Julie was oblivious to all this. Now, in September of 1985, he was actually arrested for a DUI and even stealing his friend's car. Now, for both of these, he more or less got a slap on the wrist for the DUI, and he never faced any charges for the theft of the car. Now, eventually, after some time, Herb got a job at a thrift store, and initially, he didn't like the idea of working at the thrift store, as he felt like he was way too qualified, to be working there, and he felt like he deserved something a little bit better. But eventually, he started to realize that there was some serious money to be made in thrift stores. He tried to convince the owners of the store to make minor changes to help them make more money, but they were hesitant, and they didn't show as much drive as Herb did. Now, after working for a few years in the thrift store, and after his father's passing in 1988, Herb took out a loan with the help of his mother and opened up his own chain of thrift stores. Now, by 1991, him and Julie had become very successful at managing this chain. They had just opened a second store and found themselves pretty wealthy. Now, this, of course, would be in 1991, and they would go on to purchase a large Tudor-style home and property called Fox Hollow Farm. Now, of course, during this entire time is when Herb would be killing gay men and boys around the Indianapolis and I-70 area. Now, it turns out that when 1991 hit, Herb decided to stop dumping his victims along the highway. As he now had this large house and expansive property, he felt like he could commit these crimes in the comfort of his own home, and that's part of why he felt so comfortable doing this, was because Julie would leave numerous times throughout the week to go stay at her parents' with their 3 children. Now, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, so I'm going to back up a little bit. Now, even though Herb did not enjoy having sex with Julie, as he was not physically attracted to her, they still did a handful of times over their 20-year marriage, and they did end up having 3 children. Just to kind of clarify that bit, if you heard me say children and you're like, what? So, I just wanted to clarify that. But because Herb was still kind of just behaving very weird, Julie felt a lot better leaving to be away from the house for a little bit at a time and just be with the kids rather than Herb, because Herb was more or less a weirdo. Now, Herb was obsessed with his thrift store business, and he had piles of merchandise. So much, in fact, it lined the walls of his house in numerous spots, and he wanted to open up a third location. He was obsessed with it. And this honestly explains what Tony saw when he entered the pool room of the house. Tony noted the amount of, quote-unquote junk that piled along the walls and throughout the house, and this was because Herb was buying so much merchandise, he physically didn't have any more spots on the shelves to put it. Now, Herb, of course, during this time, now started taking men and bringing them back to Fox Hollow Farm and murdering them there on the property. Now, in 1994, a turn would be made in the case when Herb and Julie's son, Eric, would uncover skeletal remains in their backyard on the Fox Hollow Farm property. When Julie saw that her son had found the skeletal remains, she was horrified. And when Herb came home from work that night, she confronted him about it and asked where these came from. Herb lied and used a cover that it used to be one of his father's surgical skeletons that he had found while cleaning out the garage, and decided to bury it to get rid of it. After all, Herb's dad was actually a doctor, so on the surface, this would kind of make sense. Now, this eased Julie, but this was clearly a lie. She still kind of felt weird about it, but she's like, it makes sense, so she kind of just didn't really think too much about it. However, again, through this whole process, she stood by her husband. At this point, back to Virgil, he had made significant headway in his investigation by this point, and now that they had the plate number from Herb's car, it was time to start putting together some pieces and trying to figure out if Herb was the killer. But Virgil needed help. He gained the assistance of a local missing persons investigator for the police named Mary Wilson. Mary initially wanted to confront Herb at his place of work to see if she could gain any information from Herb, but she had also gathered a lot of information to try and pressure him a little bit. Mary arrived at one of his Save-A-Lot thrift stores and started asking questions about the killings. Herb, of course, denied all knowledge of them and told her that she could pretty much just talk to his lawyer. Mary's next move was talking to Julie at the Fox Hollow Farm property, but before Mary could get to the Fox Hollow Farm to question her, Herb had actually called Julie and told her another lie. This time that the stores were being investigated by the police for possibly buying stolen merchandise, and that if the police arrived, to not let them in, and that he was pretty much sorting it all out. Now, when Mary arrived, she talked to Julie, and Julie refused her access to the home and said that they had not stolen any merchandise, to which Mary replied with basically, "What are you talking about?" And Julie was like, "What do you mean, what am I talking about? My husband said we were under investigation for buying stolen merchandise." And then Mary would reply basically with, like, again, "Your husband is under investigation for a string of disappearances. That's what this is about. We're not talking about any stolen merchandise." Julie was shocked, but initially she couldn't believe this either, that her husband could be responsible, so she said, again, she had no idea what Mary was talking about and refused her from taking a look around the house. Now, as time went on, Julie was putting together the pieces herself, and it became very apparent that Herb was the killer. Now, Julie at this time started to get the paperwork together to file for divorce, and she told Mary and the police about the skeleton that her son had found. And when Herb left to visit his mother for the weekend with the kids one day is when the police got their warrant and searched the Fox Hollow Farm property. Now, when investigating the area around where Eric had found the skeleton, Mary and the investigators found numerous crushed bone fragments, and upon excavation of the site, discovered roughly the remains of 11 victims. This was happening during late June 1996. Now, Herb got served custody papers pretty much that same day, and the divorce notification pretty much the same day while he was at his mother's house with the kids. And then the news of the bodies became public about them being found on the property, and this was pretty much so Julie filed for divorce, pretty much filed custody papers so she could get all of her kids back, because Julie was afraid that if this came out, that possibly Herb would do something to the kids, which, again, I don't know if that's possible, but of course you're erring on the side of caution, so I completely understand why she did that. Now, both of those happened, like, seriously, within the same weekend, within the same day, this happened, and then the bodies became public knowledge. And now, not all of the bodies that were originally unearthed, out of those 11, have even been identified to this day. And we do have names for some of the victims. However, they're still, again, to this day, there are some of these bodies that are not been fully identified, and that is mostly because the skeletons were in such bad shape. You know, the bones were crushed into numerous, like, tiny pieces. And I have to imagine extracting DNA from tiny pieces of bone fragment, especially bone fragments from the 90s or even the 80s, has to be insanely difficult. But the victims that were identified and the ones that we do have names for are the following, and I did find these. Now, I'm going to kind of rapid fire these off to you, so just stay with me. They might come fast. I'm just giving you an FYI. Now, the first one being Johnny Bayer, who was 20, went missing on May 28, 1993 in Indianapolis. Jeffrey Allen Jones, 31, went missing on July 6, 1993, also in Indianapolis. Richard Hamilton Jr., 20, went missing on July 31, 1993 in Indianapolis. Alan Livingston, 27, went missing on August 6, 1993, and again, his remains were not fully identified until October of last year. So again, when I said that not all of these bodies have been identified, that's genuine. Up next, Stephen Hale, who was 28, went missing on April 1st, 1994, also in Indianapolis. Alan Broussard, 28, went missing on June 6, 1994 in Indianapolis. Roger Goodlett, 33, went missing on July 22nd, 1994 in Indianapolis. Of course, those were the two whose families originally contacted Virgil. Mike Kern, who was 45, went missing March 31st, 1995 in Indianapolis. And Manuel Resendez, who was 34, went missing August 6th, 1993 in Indianapolis. And his remains were not fully identified until January of 2024. Now, all of these victims were from the gay bars in the local areas in Indianapolis. And like I said, there's still some of these remains that are just so crushed and so broken down that they're still trying to be identified. Now, these bodies were pretty much confirmed to be killed by Herb, as even the jacket belonging to Mike Kern was found in the Fox Hollow Farm home, which again, that's pretty much a smoking gun right there. Now, other victims from the other crimes back in the 1980s and early 1990s also corroborated and said that Herb Baumeister matched the description of the men they last saw with some of the original swath of victims. Now, with the announcement of the police findings, Herb fled the country to Ontario, Canada. Now, he would end up parking his car at Pinery Provincial Park near the bank of Lake Huron. He would go on to write a 3-page suicide note and would take his .357 Magnum handgun and take his own life. Although his secrets on whether or not he was the I-70 Strangler might remain a mystery that only he was able to tell us the full secret of. However, based on the evidence that we have, it's pretty damning and pretty much sealed. However, like I mentioned all the way back in the open, what could have complicated this case is the fact that another serial killer was operating within the same exact area during the 1980s at almost the exact same time. Another killer, known as the Highway Killer, was also targeting gay men. Larry Eiler, aka the Highway Killer, who killed 21 young men and boys between 1982 and 1984, and Larry Eiler would actually go on to confess that he killed all of these men and young boys on his deathbed in 1994 while he was awaiting his sentencing. Eiler killed these young men and boys throughout Indiana and Illinois and was prominent in the gay scenes within both Indianapolis and Chicago, Illinois. The Highway Killer's MO, though, was very different from that of Baumeister, as Eiler would often stab and mutilate his victims as well as sexually assault them. Now, I even found news articles talking about how the killings of gay men in the Indianapolis area were continuing even after Eiler was caught in 1984, and that was kind of like the question mark. That was kind of like the eyebrow raise, like, hey, Eiler was caught. Why are these gay men still, vanishing? Why are they still being found dead? Again, I'm not going to go fully in depth on Larry Eiler because, just off the initial research I did on him, just for kind of this little one paragraph of notes I'm giving you, I could do a whole episode on him just by himself, but I just wanted to kind of throw him into the mix as well because it would kind of possibly make sense that the police were so preoccupied with this case during the early 80s, and I think mostly because of the frequency in which the killings happened. That's 21 killed within a 2-year period. That's pretty crazy if you think about the grand scheme of things. And there was a whole task force assembled, if I'm not mistaken, to try and catch Eiler while this was going on. And he had been actually apprehended a previous time, and then, they let him out, and then he went out and killed more people again. So, very complex situation, very different than Baumeister. But, again, I'm thinking with the frequency of the killings and that they were so preoccupied with him that the initial killings from Baumeister kind of slept under the radar, or they were ignored because they didn't match kind of the profile of Eiler. When the killings kept happening around Indianapolis, they're like, oh, these gay men are getting strangled. Again, they're kind of low on our priority list at the time, obviously. And then, again, just kind of excuses past that point, past the point of 1984 when Eiler was apprehended. After that point, I felt like they took it way too lackadaisical and kind of just a complete lack of action, even though the signs were pointing to somebody doing these. Obviously, you look at the relations between, all these victims being strangled to death, kind of the age, kind of everything. You look at those similarities and where they're going missing from, you could say, hey, there's similarities between these that are too high to ignore. This has got to be a serial killer, and the police just didn't do that in the beginning. So, again, I feel like whenever we cover these serial killer cases or, missing persons cases, it's always kind of a consistent theme of a lack of action initially or continuously from law enforcement. And again, I hate to dog on law enforcement, obviously, all the time, but it is a reoccurring theme in these that, law enforcement initially drags their feet and then they come into it, or they just continuously drag their feet. I mean, we can look at the Maura Murray case I covered back in season 1, in just the terms of how law enforcement just did not handle that the way they needed to. And even in, the Connecticut River Valley serial killer case, that is now actually my number 1 watched episode. So anybody who has tuned into that episode, it's a very good one. I do appreciate the support on that one. You go back to that one as well, law enforcement, complete dragging of the feet, and there was just not really much evidence there. So kind of, I'm comparing apples to oranges here, but still. Now, with that being said, of course, this would normally be the part of the episode where we would talk about theories, but instead, I'm just going to give my quick thoughts on this entire case. And, of course, this was an interesting true crime case for me to cover. And although Herb Baumeister was legally never declared to be the I-70 Strangler, it is all but common knowledge at this point to me. I think, like I said, in many of these cases, if law enforcement started connecting the dots sooner, perhaps we could have stopped Herb's killings much sooner. However, in the end, it just goes to show you that serial killers have these twisted and sick fantasies, many of which that have been inside of them since adolescence, and instead of getting help for their mental conditions and trauma, they just repress it. So with that being said, on a much more serious note, if you or a loved one are experiencing any type of mental illness, of course, I hope you get the help that you need, and just know that there are people out there that love and support you. Now, of course, I chucked a lot of information at you all at once, and if you want to do your own independent research on Herb Baumeister or the I-70 Strangler, and if there happened to be some information I missed in this episode, please let me know. Feel free to Instagram direct message me, feel free to email me, put it in the comments section, however you want to do that. If there was something that I missed, please let me know. I'm more than welcome and open for people to send me, little tidbits of information I might have missed. Of course, I try to get these done in a week's worth of time, so I try and cram as much information in a compact form that I can, just so, my schedule gets so crazy sometimes. So I just try and do as best as I can for you all, the listeners. But with that being said, that's going to conclude today's episode on the I-70 Strangler. Now, if you were listening to this episode on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Those days I post new episodes will be on Tuesdays, just so everybody is aware. Now, if you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. Again, it helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, you can go ahead and follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown, where I'll be posting photographs and the custom cover art for this week's episode. As well, you can check me out on TikTok, where I do 1-minute breakdowns of every episode that I do. Not every episode as of today, because that's a lot of work for all those little breakdowns. But feel free to check me out there on TikTok as well. Same handle, Unblurring the Unknown. Check me out there. And if you happen to have any topic suggestions at all, some people have been leaving me topic suggestions right in the comment section of YouTube videos. If you want to do that as well, that's totally fine. I might not see them right away, so it might take me a little bit longer to get to them. But just so you know, like if I like your comment, like if you said, I think somebody in my comments said, hey, do the Springfield 3, and I just Googled it, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to do this one, because it just seemed very, very cool. So you can do that as well. Again, I might not see it right away, but I promise you I do check my comments. I do check my email inboxes. So if you do send me topic suggestions, I do see them and I do add them to the queue. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.